Hey, I'm Warren Sprouse. This is the Bible Forum. We're here on Sunday night for you from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time every Sunday night, whether you like it or not. We're looking at life through a biblical lens, trying to pick up some things that you might be interested in, might teach you a little something. I found something this week that fascinates me. I have been jousting with the evangelical left for years and years, decades. Because I'm not quite sure that there is such an animal. What does that mean, the evangelical left? Well, it means people who think of themselves as evangelical Christians, but they hold a leftist view politically, sometimes morally, or to some extent morally, and every other way. The Bible doesn't let you do that. But then they don't never let the Bible interfere with what they want to believe. Well, we've got a new president coming up, President-elect Donald Trump. He won the largest share of evangelicals since evangelicals became a thing. And they became a thing about 1980s. What happened? Well, the evangelical left was the crowd that was standing there, and they were pushing the Democrat cause, and they'd love to see the Republicans drift down to their level and so forth. And in this election cycle, they were not a factor. They were supposed to stand against the Donald. It didn't happen. Several leaders in this memberless movement spoke to a publication called The Literalist about the future of lefty evangelicalism. There's a fellow, Ron Sider, a distinguished professor of theology, holistic ministry, and public policy at Palmer Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, said, quote, "I'm ready to admit we're a group of leaders without followers. But we will always have our seminary and our college courses to make it feel like we're preaching to a congregation of believers." How many Americans today see themselves as peace, earth, and neighbor loving, and at the same time Jesus following Christians, and maybe even evangelicals? Well, Sider says beyond us, motioning around the focus group to the lefty evangelicals that were convened there, he said, "I'm pretty sure it's just us. We've written more books about evangelical left than there are actual progressive voters who self-identified as evangelical." That from Clinton spiritual advisor Tony Campolo. "We thought if we got covered in Religion News Service enough, people would follow. Turns out that didn't work." Well, I follow Religion News Service. That's where I get a lot of my articles on what's wrong. Campolo said the publisher came to him after the election asking him to write a book on Trump and to do it in harmony with Brian McLaren. He's another one of these guys. Campolo said, "We even had a working title, Evangelical Resistance, Hope in the Era of Trump." But he went on to say, if we're honest with ourselves, there's no hope. There's no point to this. Now, I find it interesting, but did you notice the way it works? Tony Campolo didn't say, I'd like to write another book. The publisher wanted another book from these men. That's what's going on here. Noted author. Why? Because it sells books. It doesn't have to be true. It doesn't have to be biblical. It doesn't have to be right. It just has to be sensational enough to make money for the publishers. They come to these guys and gals and ask them to write books. The undisputed leader of progressive evangelicalism, measured by media coverage, is Sojourner's founder, Jim Wallis. Calls himself a Christian. Doesn't believe anything that the Bible teaches. He's proposing a 4-year moratorium on media coverage of the white evangelical left. Leave it alone. Let it go away. Don't talk about it. Instead, he says, turn our focus away from promoting a non-existent political force and instead try to actually build one. He said, that's why I'm also canceling all my speaking engagements and the trips to Davos for the World Economic Forum. That way, perhaps during Trump's second term, there will actually be something to promote. In her concession speech after losing the presidential election to Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton quoted a passage of Scripture from Galatians. Did you listen? It's actually from Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. And according to ChristianToday.com, she acknowledged that the loss was painful, but able to maintain an optimistic tone. I just heard on the radio today from an insider that said she was weeping and inconsolable from about 11 o'clock the night of election until well into the morning the next day. She wouldn't get out of bed. She wouldn't talk to anybody. She couldn't function. And she came how close to being president of the United States? And she said in her speech, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we will not give up. Let's have faith in each other. Let's not grow weary. Let us not lose heart, for there are more seasons to come and more work to do, she said. This is a call to faith in God for the reward that He brings? Or is it faith in one another? Faith in the cause, faith in politics to achieve their end. Don't worry, stay with the stuff, it'll come back around. Well, this is a very dispirited group, these evangelicals on the left and the politicians. You see them in the streets, they're going nuts. They cannot believe that their candidate didn't get elected. They were and continue to be shocked. And they are dispirited. But they will be back. And the next time they may actually win. Largely because they've learned some things. And partly because the ruling party generally becomes complacent, begins believing their own rhetoric, and after 8 years, we're all tired of them too. Have you noticed how many people and groups have been re-energized by a Trump win? Have you noticed how many state and local elections went conservative this time? That can all change at the midterm. That can certainly change after 8 years with the Donald. People will begin to believe they can do better with something else, something different. And politicians constantly are paying people to come up with different stuff. We're fickle, largely because we have no rudder, no immovable center. In this world, only God is immovable. And the liberals have made Him flexible. Case in point, a survey recently reported that more millennials agree with Karl Marx than they do the Bible when it comes to issues of work ethics. The Christian Post reported that the study, which was conducted by YouGov and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, included 2,300 participants, and it found that 64% of millennials agree with a statement from Marx that says, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his need. Why did 64% of them agree with that? Well, number one, they have no idea what it means. These are public school educated kids. And it sounds good. It's from the heart. That sounds fair. They didn't know where it came from. And without knowing where it came from, they didn't know what it really meant. At the same time, only 53% agreed with a statement from the Bible that says, if any would not work, neither should he eat. They don't like that. That sounds harsh. The study found an overall trend that millennials tend to be less critical of socialism and communism than their parents and their grandparents were. 80% of baby boomers and 91% of elderly Americans believe communism is a problem. But only 55% of millennials have that same concern. 57% of Americans overall said they have an unfavorable view of communism. Only 37% of millennials could say that. 45% of the 16 to 20-year-olds even said they would vote for a socialist. 21% said they'd vote for a communist. In America, do they not read the paper? Do they not watch television? Do they not know anything about what's going on in communist countries? No. They only know what they're being told. According to the survey, many millennials were not familiar with famous communist leaders. Almost half had never heard of Mao Zedong and the millions that he killed off so that he could have power. 40% hadn't heard of Che Guevara. 18% said they didn't know much about Joseph Stalin either. 33% hadn't heard of Vladimir Lenin, and 18% didn't know about Putin. They didn't know who he was. The study found a growing acceptance of socialists and Marxist viewpoints among younger generations of Americans, children who did not grow up during the Cold War. Considered alongside the broad support among millennials for Bernie Sanders and what he's preaching, the poll, for example, found more support for quotes by Sanders than Milton Friedman or the Bible. Socialism is growing support in America. Socialism is just that close to communism, totalitarianism, and all the wonderful things that poor people, lazy people, people who legitimately can't get ahead in this world for whatever reason, gravitate toward with the hope that they'll be able to have what perhaps you and I have without the effort. And that socialism, communism, all of these isms will give it to them. But here in our own country, there are people who want to shuttle all of us into major metropolitan areas and get us off the land because we're destroying it and because we're creating global warming or climate change. And they even have plans for such things. High-rise apartments, railroad, light rail that connects things. No cars. Everything happens right here. If you want to go visit somebody in another place, you have to get on the train and go, and that way we can control everybody. Is that the way it's supposed to work? The leftists believe that. And even Hillary, in her quoting and in her commentary of her biblical quote, is expressing that. It's only a matter of time if the Lord tarries.